Hello and welcome to Families Made Differently by Bex Baker. Today we are chatting to Harriet, a social worker. I am so excited for all that she has to share with us. We have a lovely guest with us. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Harriet Langford and I'm a social worker. I work in referral assessment team in a local authority in London. My role to work following the MASH team, completing assessments with families and children, and I get to kind of work with a broad range of children and families.
Do you want to just explain the term MASH?
Team. Yeah.
So we're on the same page.
It stands for Multi-Agency Safeguarding Hub, and it's where schools and hospitals and the police put all of their kind of concerns. They will filter that into our Multi-Agency Safeguarding Hub, and then if it's required that a social worker goes out on a visit, then I'll be sent out to go out and meet families and decide what happens next. Prior to that, I was working as a looked after children social worker, and I did that for 2 years, so I got to work with foster carers and looked after children and in that kind of sphere. And then prior to that, I was studying as a social worker, and I did a placement in a fostering team, so I worked as a supervising social worker, meeting foster carers, providing that support. I got to do the skills to foster training and deliver that training.
Great, so you have lots of experience by the sounds of it, which is so helpful. How did you come to be a social worker?
I have a passion for working with children and young people. When I came out of school, I just felt that the best thing for me to do was to do something with children. So I decided to study early childhood studies. And whilst I was doing that course, I had the opportunity to do a placement. And I did that at Exeter Prison. And I was working with families visiting relatives in prison. And I found it really interesting. And it was something that I could really see myself doing, because you're working with people and there was a perception of working with prisoners, which is completely unfounded. You're working with people and that's it. They're just people, ordinary people. And when I came out of university, I felt that I wanted to do something more. My degree had given me skills in psychology and child development and things, but actually I felt that I wanted to go into something where I'd get to work with maybe more vulnerable people. I worked in a mother and baby unit and worked with young parents, and then from there I just felt that kind of social work was for me. And so I did a master's and trained and became a social worker. It's been a really good journey. I've had a lot of experiences along the way that's led me to this point, but for me it's just been that kind of passion for working with children.
Did you feel that God was part of that calling you into it?
There's a mission statement for a social worker, which is very similar to what Jesus kind of calls us to. Jesus says that we should work with the last, the least and the lost, that we should be there for those people. And actually the mission statement of a social worker is to work with kind of the most vulnerable people, to advocate for people, to be alongside people. Whilst I was studying, one of my lecturers in a seminar said, "I don't understand it." They've looked into it and they said that there's a number of social workers that are Christian, and he was like, "I don't understand. Social work is a secular thing." And I turned around and said, I completely disagree. I gave him this example of the teaching of Christianity and how it links into the social work mission statement, and he had no idea that the two were linked. So much of what we do in social work is very much linked to kind of charities and kind of the early church's work. I just feel really called to this profession, and I couldn't really imagine myself doing anything else. And I think the idea that I get to kind of go into work and work with families who need a food bank, and they call me up and say, I'm in need of this, and as a part of my job I get to do that, I feel is a really good privilege for me to be able to be in that position, to be able to support really vulnerable people.
How have you seen fostering and adoption shape families you've worked with?
When I first went into social work, I had a perception of foster carers. It's a massive sacrifice on family life, and I think I've really seen the way that families have kind of got around a young person. I had a young person placed with a Christian family. They had their own children, and they really thought about the young person and they tailored what they were doing for that young person. The children really benefited from the fact that they had a young person in their family. And obviously when you foster or adopt, that child is part of your family. It's not just it's not a job. They are in your life. And I think certain foster carers are really great at kind of taking that responsibility on. And I've seen many families really kind of build that child into their life, take them everywhere, and they become part of that family. And it's really nice to see how children are impacted, how the birth children, how the cousins, how aunties, uncles, things like that get to kind of be a part of that as well.
Yeah, and church pays into that as well, which is great in regards to Christian family.
The child getting to go along to church, the child that I knew in this Christian family, the family were into Wren Collective. the Christian band. I'd go and visit him and he'd talk to me about this band, and I said, oh, I know that band. He was like, what? And obviously because I wouldn't say that I'm a Christian at work to children and families generally, and he was like, how do you know that band? You don't know that band. And then we started singing along to My Lighthouse, and he was like, what? Yeah, how do you know that? And it was just really funny, and just the fact that this family had been able to bring him along to church, and they bought him a CD of Ren Collective, and they bought him a t-shirt, and because he loved this band, and he didn't really necessarily know that it was a Christian band, but actually it was just really special that they kind of brought him into that family.
Yeah, what a great influence they had, and how they spoke in such a lovely way into his life just for a little bit. What is your favourite memory so far of working in the industry?
I was a looked after social worker for 2 years, and it was one of the hardest times because it is a massive sacrifice. You're working with young people and children. You're their parent, effectively. Obviously, the foster carer is another parent. Sadly, sometimes children will move from foster carer to foster carer because of their behaviour potentially, or because of something else. So you're the constant in that child's life quite often, and so you build up these incredible relationships with young people. There was a young person who I visited, and he had his headphones on and he had his hood up, and I visited him and I said, hi, I'm your social worker. He just didn't talk to me. I just sat there for half an hour of really excruciating kind of awkwardness where our teenager just ignores you and you just try to like get out of it. I'd worked with him for 2 years, and every 6 weeks, because I had to visit every 6 weeks, I'd go along and I'd sit there awkwardly. By the end, when I'd kind of got to that point, we'd have a chat, we'd joke. I'd broken down that barrier. To be able to go back to become a looked after children social worker does take a lot of commitment, because you have to be there for those children. But for me, I think the most special thing is the relationships I built with those young people, and it was really, really difficult when I left that role to tell those young people. For me, it was going for hot chocolates, it was going bowling and going to the cinema, and not all social workers get the opportunity to do that, but for me, my primary focus was about that relationship building, and for them to kind of see me as that trusted person. And so yeah, I would love, if I have the time at some point, to be able to go back into that role, because I think it is something really special to build those relationships with young people.
I should have asked you earlier on, like, which of the 3 roles you've had has been your favourite, but by the sounds of it, I think I might have just got the answer.
Yeah, so I think it's difficult, because I'd say the role I'm in now, it's quite fast paced, and you deal with things within 3 weeks is the idea, and you move it on quickly. You don't get the opportunity to build those lasting relationships, and I feel it's less emotionally demanding. You're moving things on quickly. Whereas as a looked after children social worker, some of my colleagues were there for 7 years. They knew children for 7 years, and obviously sometimes children do stay in one placement for 7 years, but sometimes they move across different placements. And so definitely it was probably my favourite role because of the fun times I had with young people and children that I got to know, but definitely the hardest job I've probably had.
I feel like you can't do it forever. It's like a bit short-lived, is it, because of just the emotional requirements of you?
I would definitely say that the age range of those working with looked after children, you do see they're kind of generally younger social workers, I would say, just because of the time commitment and the demand. I was having to travel for 5 hours at one point to meet a young person in their placement. It'd be 5 hours there, 5 hours back. I once went all the way there, and he wanted me to take him to McDonald's, and I wasn't allowed to take him to McDonald's, and he refused to talk to me, so I travelled all the way there. And he wouldn't let me, he wouldn't talk to me at all. So I literally had to travel all the way back, having just gone there for 5 hours, just for him to kind of shout at me and not talk to me. So yeah, it can be really, really difficult. But obviously looking back, it was quite fun as well.
What's your favourite age range in it? Because obviously there's babies in the system all the way to almost adults.
I think it's really interesting. I think I obviously really like the younger ones as well, and I think you can kind of have fun playing with them, and maybe the teenagers you can develop a better relationship with in time, probably like 16 plus, especially if you're working with them long term, when they know that you can kind of be real with them and just be authentic. I quite like being that and being able to just break down those barriers, be yourself, and they just kind of get to know you, and I feel that they can then be a bit more honest with you, and that's why it can just take that time to build that relationship. They just need to know that you're not going to go anywhere, that you're going to be there for the long term, and that they can just talk to you. Whereas I feel like with younger children, they're quite quick to accept you. So I think the older ones, you have to work a bit harder.
The reward's greater almost.
100%, yeah.
How has God been speaking to you through your work?
So I feel quite often within social work, some situations can feel really hopeless. Enter a situation and you can feel like crying because You'll get to a point you think, this is so sad, or you can always predict what's going to happen when you see the same patterns occurring in families, or you can see a path that a family or a child is taking, and you just think, don't do that, please don't do that. You can see what's going to happen. And sometimes being a Christian, I know that I can pray and I can speak to God and I can lift up this family to God and say, it's not in my strength, I can't do this in my own power, in my own strength. If I wasn't a Christian, I would really struggle in this job. I dealt with a very difficult case last week, and one of my colleagues who isn't a Christian messaged me and said, at least you've got your faith, that you can turn to your faith. And I think my colleagues all know that I'm a Christian. They were trying to support me and be supportive, and the way that they could deal with that was by saying they almost could see that my faith was my strength. And I just think without that, without God, without that hope, some of these situations can feel more hopeless. Whereas actually I know that there is a hope. I bring God into my work, really. If I'm driving to work or driving to a situation, I'll say, God, be with me in this conversation, help me through this, help calm this situation, help, bring that into that.
Are there many Christian social workers that you work with?
So when I'd been a student, there had been a couple of times when people had said to me, you have to leave religion at the door. One person in particular was quite critical of me being a Christian and was very much like, it's got nothing to do with social work. You shouldn't be talking about it. And as a student, I felt, right, I can't talk about this. And when I started initially, I didn't talk to my colleagues about being a Christian because I didn't want people to say that to me. I didn't want people to kind of put me down for being a Christian and kind of say to me, the concern being that if you're working with vulnerable people, they don't want you to be sharing your faith with people or trying to convert people, which obviously I would not be in my intention. So I think in this role that I've come into, I feel a bit more confident to be able to say to my colleagues that I'm a Christian. Just in conversations and things, I've come across a number of my colleagues that are Christians, and that's been really nice because you almost feel like you've got a bit of an ally that kind of gets where you're coming from, and you can say, oh, can you pray for this, or can you pray for this situation? Yeah, it's just really nice that people kind of get what you're doing. There's a couple of Christians that I've been able to chat to at work, which has been really helpful.
Have you experienced God's blessing in your work?
I've been trained since 2017, and in that time I feel like I've progressed well in this job, and I think God has kind of shown me each time how well placed I'm in this position just by the kind of recognition of colleagues and management. I feel God is blessing this work that I'm doing by saying this is where you're supposed to be. Quite often when I'm stuck in a certain situation, people will say the fact that God has picked you and chosen you in that place, that person needed you to speak to them. And so I do feel that God has kind of really blessed this work and kind of blessed me in this position. That encouragement to keep on going when you don't really want to. Yeah. The fact that I still really actually enjoy what I do is kind of a blessing itself. There will be times when I hate the job or I hate the situation, it's really, really difficult, but actually most days I think I really do love what I do.
It's not hard to get out of bed in the morning, every morning.
Yeah.
Just some mornings.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, that's good. What advice would you give someone starting on their journey into maybe social work or even into fostering or adoption? Because I feel like you kind of could cover both.
Yeah. In terms of fostering, I think it's that managing expectations. The children that come into care have experienced a great deal. Sometimes people that go into fostering will kind of imagine this perfect child who's going to come into their family and they're going to be able to be that role model for that child and they're going to be able to bring them alongside. But actually, these children have experienced their own families, and some of them, despite what they've experienced, will be massively attached and bonded to that family and then have taken out of that family and placed into a new family. For new foster carers, what they're signing up for is amazing and the reward is going to be amazing, but they have to be able to put that work in and be that consistent person. I've seen a lot of foster placements break down, which has been really, really sad. Anyone kind of entering into it needs to kind of be really resilient and be willing to offer that constant reassurance and that love repeatedly, even when it's thrown back at you, being able to kind of constantly do that. It's not an easy ask. Anyone entering into it, managing that expectation and knowing that what they're going to be entering into might be quite challenging. And yeah, I guess as a social worker, for people think about social work's so varied. You have so many different teams, so many different avenues that you can explore. If you don't want to work with the fast-paced front line, you can work supporting foster carers, which is a massive role in itself, and being that support and being that person on the end of the phone, being that person that kind of visits all the time and reassures carer when they've got a child that won't eat or a child that won't sleep, is misbehaving in the house or something. Being able to be that support. Anyone considering social work is a really rewarding career and something that I feel God can call you into. It's a really fulfilling job.
Is there anything else you'd like to add? Because we have gotten to the end of our questions.
No, just thank you for having me, and yeah, I hope people listening to this will have felt that it was useful and learnt more about what it is to work in this field.
Great, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
This was Families Made Differently, the podcast designed to share stories from Christians across the UK whose lives and families have been shaped by fostering and adoption. Make sure you have your notifications turned on for wherever you find your podcasts, And please follow us on Instagram so that you don't miss any updates.